So our next presentation is actually another way to make a difference, if you think there isn't another way to make a difference. The two women that are coming up here to speak now are Sylvia McAdam and Sheelah McLean. And these two women are co-founders of the Idle No More movement that has swept not only across the city of Saskatoon, the province of Saskatchewan, the country of Canada, the continent of North America, but they have international connections and powwows going on in countries and cities that they have never even visited. Sylvia McAdam is a Nihio from Treaty 6 territory on Turtle Island. She has a law degree here from the University of Saskatchewan, so we claim her as one of ours, and we're very, very happy to claim her as one of ours. And she also has a human justice degree from the University of Regina. She is a recipient of the Carol Guller Human Rights Award, an Activist of the Year Award in Social Change, and she enjoys her time on land and water and her people's territory. Sheelah McLean is another University of Saskatchewan person that we claim as ours, and she's a PhD candidate in anti-racist and anti-colonial education. She's been a teacher in secondary and adult education for 20 years and is an instructor here at the university over the last 8 years. She works on projects that build scholarship policies and practice in order to address inequality and the issues faced by marginalized groups, particularly focusing on historical legacy and oppression experienced by Indigenous people within white settler society. So I don't know how much these two women are going to talk about themselves, so I'm going to tell you that I've heard both of them speak. I've had an opportunity to be around Sylvia for the last number of years. She's also written a book about elder laws. She works a lot with elders in her community and in the community generally in Saskatchewan, and she wears quite openly her heart in terms of the fact that spirituality is a component of humanness that you cannot separate, and that, you know, when when we had the chief on a hunger strike last year in front of Parliament, I know that Sylvia had an instrumental role in going forward with the male Aboriginal leadership there and being brave enough as a woman to instruct them on the fact that there's protocol in every territory, that there's spiritual protocol, and that our men had to follow the protocols in those communities. And that's a pretty hard place to put yourself, actually. And I've heard Sheelah speak as well, and she's got connections across the continent as well, and is one of the most gentle, loving speakers while kicking you in the butt at the same time that I've ever had the honor to listen to. So I'd like you to welcome the Idle No More women to our panel.
Okay, we have to move quickly because we don't have too much time, and Sheelah has to take off right away. And we're swamped a lot most days, and Idle No More is not in the media as much, but we're still extraordinarily busy. But moving right along, there's something I want all of you to get an idea of. We're always asked as Indigenous people, well, why didn't you guys do something? So I'm going to move very quickly. I'm probably going to sound like an auctioneer, so you have to follow me. Okay? So here we go. So Indigenous resistance. I'm going to go back a little ways. Since the Indian Act was amended to repeal the prohibition on hiring lawyers, there's been thousands, if not like hundreds of cases brought before where Indigenous people have sued or have been sued. And there's an image of a resistance that happened in 2010. And here's another one. In the last 2 decades, there's been a series of direct, hundreds of blockades, sit-ins, train blockades, occupations, and even armed confrontations. And again, we see an image of Oka on here. And this is, Sheelah's going to speak to this one.
One of the things I thought would be important to think about today is the context that we're talking about these issues. And of course, we're talking about it in a colonial context. And as a white settler, that's what I've been studying for the last 10 years, is the impact of colonialism on the context of Canada, how it has created and maintained white supremacy, how it has created and maintained patriarchy and heteronormativity. And these are the issues that we're struggling with Idle No More in terms of how do we create new ideologies, new discourse, new policies and practices that speak back to the inequality that's created around these identity constructions. And of course, one of the things that's happening, that has been happening for hundreds of years on this continent, is the criminalization of Indigenous sovereignty and the criminalization of Indigenous rights to protect their lands and waters. And the system, of course, is going against, in many ways, its own colonial laws, because if you look at the Constitution, if you look at UNDRIP, the United Nations Rights on of Indigenous Peoples, which our government, after 2 years, finally signed on to, you can see that this criminalization is purposeful. That really in a colonial context like Canada, in any colonial context, what you have is a government that strives to control every single institution, our education institutions, our justice institutions, of course, our government institutions, all of them created and maintained, and also using this to control the lands and resources. So the resistance that we see with Idle No More, as Sylvia has talked about, is not a new resistance. This resistance is 500 years old. But what we're doing is working very hard to figure out how we can work in solidarity, Indigenous peoples and settlers, to fight back against a system of colonialism that not only has been attacking Indigenous people for 500 years, but as we can see, as Indigenous peoples have the inherent rights to protect the land and water, it's going to protect all of us as Canadian citizens, and that we have to learn how to work in solidarity and stand behind Indigenous peoples as they're leading this movement. And of course, it's been Indigenous women that have been leading this movement, with men working in solidarity and settlers and people of color working in solidarity. Do you want this?
Yeah, sure. And again, this is from BC. I'm not going to pronounce the name because I honor their name. I'll just let you read it. I probably would mispronounce it. But in 1995, 17 Sundancers were fencing in their sacred arbor against cows. And as a result, the ensuing conflict involved 400 RCMP, 6 APCs, and 77,000 rounds of ammunition. And this is because they built a fence. And this is in Gustafson Lake, in a corner there where you see the red truck. It got blown up after the photo was taken. And this is again in BC. The hereditary chiefs stood together in 1995, and they did it again in 1997. And this is Grassy Narrows.
And some of you may already know that Grassy Narrows is one of the longest standing barricades in Canada at almost 10 years. And what they're doing right now is they're trying to protect their hereditary lands from clear cutting. And one of the things I think that's important for us to think about is how are people marked as terrorists? How are people marked as like identities that are somehow against the Canadian government by protecting their own lands and territories? And what Idle No More is striving to do, we know that social movements are extremely powerful, and I think that's where the real change is going to come. It's social movements that are going to pressure this government to change its policies and practices. It's the grassroots that are going to make the difference in this country. And we know that social movements have stopped wars, have ended wars. We know that they've taken down corporations, and we know that they've taken down governments, and very recently as well. So Idle No More becomes a threat. And so the government very quickly passes laws to criminalize. And one of the things we're doing is using social media to try and change the discourse about how Canadians think of something like a barricade, that it actually is a protection of the land. That's what it is, and a protection of the water for all of us, that this is not a criminal or violent activity, that the violence is actually coming from the colonial society, from the state, and from the justice system. The violence is not coming from the people trying to protect their lands and waters.
And again, we see the Luba Concrete. To this day, we're in communication with them, trying their very best to defend their lands and their waters. And because of they're still very connected to the land. And this is their land now. $14 billion of resources, unceded, unsurrendered lands $14 billion of resources being extracted, and they get nothing or very little. Burnt Church, Mi'kmaq, I met with them as well. Even though in a Supreme Court decision, their treaty rights were recognized, every time they go out to the water, they're criminalized. Again, murdered and missing women, a direct link to extractive industries, the human trafficking that comes out of those industries. Delgamuukw, 1997, although it is a Supreme Court decision, I won't go over it, all of you should know this. This ruling does not affect Canada or the province's strategies to extinguish Aboriginal title. And again, from BC, in 2004, people built winter lodges. These were plowed over, even though that land in question, it's not even supposed to be a question, is recognized in treaty. This is something that was posted during that time. In 2004, no Indians allowed beyond this point. Again, I was there recently in Caledonia, and I told them, if you want to talk about peace and justice, then we need to talk about giving back the land, the ones that have been in agreement through treaties. And this is a group of Indigenous leaders, that we call them KI here, because I'm not going to pronounce that again because that's Soto. And this is a mining company that they were trying to keep out of, again, unsurrendered, unceded land. They had to pay that company to stay out of their lands. Repatriation of Constitution. Thousands marched. Bill C-45. That's what triggered Idle No More. So here we go, Idle No More. So I'm going to move quickly on these pictures in Montreal, Edmonton, Toronto, Whistler, James Bay to Ottawa, Attawapiskat, Cape Breton, Windsor, Vancouver, Victoria, Ottawa, Lethbridge. Young people stood up. That's what made this movement different and amazing and powerful and incredible, because they understood. They came out of their houses and walked with us and sang and danced and went to those places that are excluded. International. We got Kenya, Norway, Hawaii, Morocco, all over the world, across the Americas, overseas, by Twitter. And here's my story. This is where Idle No More began for me. I had even though I have a law degree, I understood that I could not turn to the colonizers' law. I was like,
Okay, some of the other things that we were going to talk about, and I think is important for us to think about, is resistance, and what does that look like. And so there are many places that are resisting right now the ongoing violence and attacks. And of course, what do these attacks look like? Is what they look like is protection of the corporations and the corporate interests to turn Canada into an extraction state. Now, we've been extracting, and our economy and our wealth as Canada comes from Indigenous lands and resources. But this is definitely an onslaught that is getting more and more extreme. If you go to the tar sands, you'll see the extremity of what people are willing to do to take oil out of the ground, for instance, or to continue to take resources in spite of warnings over and over again by scientists that are telling us that we won't be able to survive the next century if we don't stop now. And so what Idle No More does is has a very urgent message of protecting Indigenous sovereignty and self-determination, and also protecting the land and water that's going to affect us all eventually. Now, this is the Unistoten camp, and I actually have had the opportunity to meet with Hereditary Chief Togasty and his wife Frida many times this year. And what they've done is they've built cabins, and they have a place that they are all living right now. And as long as they're occupying their land, which is legal, they can protect that land from pipelines, and that's exactly what they're doing. Anytime Frida and Warner leave the camp, there are helicopters that go around because they're waiting for people to leave that land so they can continue to try and build a pipeline. And so this is some of the work that Indigenous activists are doing to resist the ongoing attacks on their land and territories.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm doing this right now. This is my dad's traditional lands, unceded, unsurrendered, and there's logging activities going on even as I stand here. I was so desperate to protect it, I posted signs all over the place that said Treaty 6 territory, no trespassing. I fell off a few of those trees, by the way, and for some reason it worked. It did work on the sections of the land where I wanted them to stop. And now I want you to understand that I went to meetings with Sask Environment, and they told me, we're not stopping. We're not stopping because these trees pay for the hospitals, they pay for the legislature, they pay for the operation and maintenance of these buildings. And I said, well, you're destroying our lands. And they started giving me papers, and they said, and in those papers it said, they're intentionally blocking roads that led to the historic access of our lands. And I'm not saying that it happened last year or the year ago. Even as early as a month and a half ago, I found the road that I always had access to blocked. And then I emailed Sask Environment, and they haven't answered me yet why that happened. And this one, Sarnia, I went there. It's the first ever affected area on the birth of children. There's more females born. There's 63 factories in and around that reserve, and they're told not to leave their windows open at night, and they cannot grow gardens anymore. And when I left from there was more permits being issued for fracking. That's unbelievable, the kind of activity that's out there on the land. And if you're disconnected and you're not out there, you're not going to see this. And I didn't see it when I was in law school. I didn't. It wasn't until I wrote a chapter in my book about land that I went back and I was shocked and I was just stunned at how much activity there is.
I want to talk about the most recent event, which is Elsa Bog, and how powerful this image is. And what this talks about, of course, is the fact that we have to identify these laws as racist laws, and that we've had a history of systemic racism in this country, and that Indigenous peoples have been facing genocide and continue to face genocide from all our colonial institutions. There is absolutely no way that if this was a group of white settlers that were blocking, that there would be snipers pointing their guns at elders and pregnant women. At Elsa Bog, the Mi'kmaq people and some of their allies were trying to block fracking, one of the most dangerous things that we can do, which is to pour water and chemicals into the ground looking for natural gas, and then leave those chemicals in the ground, and of course the ground becomes fractured and it becomes part of our water table. It gets into our water. And there are actually videos and pictures of people lighting their water coming out of the tap on fire. What this image does is it shows you that at the front lines of this struggle, there were women that were standing against about 50 RCMP dressed in riot gear. And it helps us to think about, too, who was ready for violence? How were people dressed? What were they carrying? And you can see that she was carrying a feather and that they had drums with them. And of course, the media overwhelmingly focused on the burning police cars, and nobody knows how those cars, started on fire. Of course, everybody has a different story about what happened there, but the truth is, we know that those kinds of acts can justify further violence to the Canadian public, that's the truth of what happens in these instances. Now, SWN did leave. That's the company from Texas that wants to do fracking in New Brunswick. And the good news is, and this shows you the importance of resistance movements, is right now New Brunswick has a moratorium on fracking. and they're discussing it because not only did Indigenous people stand up and put their bodies on the line, but most of the settlers that live in that area also said, I don't think we want fracking here. And so this is where the solidarity comes in. This is where the importance of standing behind this movement comes in, is that we have to look at these instances and see that this is not just a single incident. And that's, I think, the power of Idle No More, is that it's showing us that there are all these places across Canada where this is happening. And that as settlers, we should be outraged at the continued racism and violence and genocide but towards Indigenous peoples. And that we can't even use the word racism in our parliament because it's unparliamentary language, but yet they can pass laws that do this kind of violence to people over and over and over again. And so for settler Canadians to stand up is so significant right now, and we have more and more ally groups joining us. We have many environmental groups. We met with David Suzuki, and his foundation wants to look at how to support Idle No More. We work with Lead Now, which is an environmental group that works out of BC. We work with Council of Canadians, who just recently gave Idle No More Activists of the Year awards. And so there's all these different groups coming together, and it's so significant because we're going to have to work together in order to stop what's happening.
How can you support Idle No More? Don't be silent. Find your voice. If it's in law, and if you're a grassroots, if you don't have a law degree, find your voice. It's very important that we not be silent. Silence, of course, it's like acquiescence, right? Compliance is consent. So silence is consent. Write letters to your government, vote. And this is for the young people, because we hear a lot of criticism towards young people that they don't vote. Alternative energy. We need to start moving towards that. Pretty soon we will not have a choice. It's not going to be a choice. Right now our privilege is defending for what we have. 5 to 10 years from now the dialogue will be, where will we get clean water? It won't be defending. Join Idle No More or other events. I tell people, call your movement Chicken Little, I don't care. If you're defending for land and water, I'll join you, I will support you. Be prayerful and peaceful. And that's our website, www.idlenomore.ca.
You can get emails from the website, email updates of things that are happening across the country. And we also now have text blasts, so you can tell there's youth involved in the movement. So we can blast out text to people in the area to let them know what kind of events are happening, or update them particularly on land struggles, which is one of the things we do.
And I think we have time for questions because Sheelah has to go very quickly here. She's going to Montreal. And I'm getting ready to go to California. So if you're not hearing about Idle No More in the media, really question that. Yeah. And as for Elizabeth May, when you said that violence and sexism and all those things that are acceptable in the workplace, I put that with Idle No More as well. There's the negative and the positive. You see a lot of that in the media. We were called idiots banging on drums. You know, I've quit looking at that. Sun Media is particularly bad. We refuse to do any kind of interviews with them. Why is it acceptable to have those kind of comments in the media in a place where we perceive ourselves to be democratic?
Yeah, and I would say the last thing before we go to questions is just to look at how inequality is produced and maintained through all of our institutions, and what we can do to fight back against that, because sometimes it seems like it's invisible, but it's really not invisible. It becomes very clear as you start to try and understand how inequality is produced and maintained in this country, and how it's justified, and what discourses and ideologies justify that ongoing inequality. So Marilyn, did you want to?
I'm just going to allow the microphone to go around. So any questions here?
Yeah, I don't know that I have a question so much as to just express deeper concerns about the marginalization of First Nations protests and environmental protests, and more than that, the demonization of them. The fact that CSIS, the RCMP, and CSEC, which is the strange group that was hacking into the Brazilian government's phones, communication security Establishment Canada. It's strange because those words actually don't string together with any meaning. But they have been holding briefings for energy companies on the activities of First Nations and environmental groups as potential security threats to energy facilities. So it's the essentially the hijacking of governmental spy agencies to become the private agents of corporate interests. And I have been shocked by how badly and biased the coverage of the Rexton Mi'kmaq protests were. There's no recognition in the national media that the First Nations were in complete solidarity with the majority of New Brunswickers. And I hate to tell you, it's the government of Newfoundland and Labrador that just announced the moratorium. The Premier of New Brunswick is still pushing for fracking. And so we have Quebec and Newfoundland and Labrador saying moratorium on fracking. But the solidarity, the fact that those protests were peaceful up until the point the RCMP moved in. And I made a statement, press release, and tweeted out concern about why the RCMP had taken the assault strategy they did on that peaceful protest in New Brunswick. And the violence of the response, now that not that you can judge things much on Twitter, but it was one of the more violent sets of responses I've seen. So I guess my question would be, how in Idle No More can you and are you preparing for the notion that we have to be highly alert to the probability of agents provocateurs infiltrating the movement, that we have to be highly alert in the environmental movement and in First Nations as we go into conflicts over things like the Enbridge pipeline, that if anyone in those groups proposes anything that involves violence, I'd say it's a 90% probability they're working for CSIS and the RCMP, so we need to actually maintain strict rules of complete nonviolence and of no tolerance, not diversity of tactics, no thank you, no tolerance whatsoever for anything that could lead to everyone involved being charged with conspiracy to commit some form of crime. I mean, I'm very concerned about the level of spy agency interest in legitimate protests.
Yeah. Go ahead. No, you. Oh, okay. Well, we're already, we know we've been infiltrated. We know that. Not to sound like I'm all conspiracy like that or anything, but the reality of the situation is we are a very peaceful threat against the powers to be that be or whatever. We're talking about having nonviolent direct action training for people that are supporters of Idle No More, and we have webinar trainings and all these different things that are coming up. What else could we add to that? Yep. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think education and nonviolent direct action is really key, and that's something that's been happening over the past year. And I also think, there's a group of lawyers that work for the movement, pro bono, that give advice. Also, we're raising money for lots of different court cases and helping to do that in terms of protecting people that are in land struggles. So those are some of the things that are happening right now. I know, the government never used to listen to us, but now they listen to us every day. Every day.
In fact, sometimes even this holiday coming up, if we're sending emails to each other, we say, "Happy holidays, you too, CSIS."
Yeah. And actually, when we smile for pictures, we don't say cheese anymore. We say CSIS.
Yeah, we're aware of that. So.
I have a question. Do you have any concerns about the undue influence, I would suggest, of Cameco Corporation in this university? And considering the impact right now of the peoples of northern Saskatchewan with all the uranium mines?
Do you want me? Yeah, because you work here. Okay. Yeah, it's definitely something we've talked about, is not just this university, but the privatization of all our universities. And that what this does is it questions academic freedom. It questions where our dollars are being spent in terms of, corporate dollars to research particular types of extraction industries, or particular types of discourse that justifies the ongoing inequality, the ongoing corporatization of the country. And so absolutely it's a concern, and it's something that we continue to think about and talk about. Of course, Howard Woodhouse from the College of Education wrote a great book on the privatization of the university and did a study of this actual campus. So I think it's really important to look at the research of that and how we can, as scholars and academics and students, continue to resist our universities turning into, you know, a space for corporate profit rather than a space for academic freedom, where we can actually look at supporting our society towards social justice and environmental justice rather than, you know, a neoliberal approach of just everything being about profit and everything being about supporting, you know, corporate goals. And that's exactly what's going to happen to this space. The corporations have the money and they have the power to do that. And so it's going to be a grassroots movement on this campus that fights back.
As somebody who's watching from the university, the way our students at this campus have become engaged in issues is unprecedented, I would say. We've got students speaking up all over. We've got I Don't Know More movements springing up constantly. And I don't know, for those of you who aren't from here and haven't been engaged in the movement, if you have a real appreciation about how hard it is for the government to deal with these four women and their millions of followers, because they are not using traditional hierarchical models to deal with anything. And so it's, who is your leader? Who's your leader? And well, I'm not the leader. Are you the leader? No, I'm not the leader. These people are all the leaders. And so it's very difficult to kind of get your hands around that. And it's working very effectively, I would argue.
And actually, you could see that, you know, the racism and sexism at play when Chief Spence was sort of constructed in the media as the leader of the movement, and how the attacks and the assaults that she had to endure were just unprecedented.
And it's not something that hasn't happened before either, because that's what happened with treaty development. Is if some of the chiefs wouldn't participate in that, they would find some that would. And so that's happening within this movement too. There's lots of efforts to try to divide and conquer among Indigenous people as well. We have time for one more question. Anybody? We're really, to say these women are hard to get a hold of doesn't come close. Okay, they're hard to get a hold of. They're so in demand. And so if you have any burning I don't know more questions, please feel free to ask. Otherwise, thank you on behalf of this audience for coming and taking time with us today, ladies.